Right, in this video I want to talk about physical conversations. What's a physical conversation? A physical conversation is like a normal conversation, except that it is physical in the sense that rather than using words, which are sounds made by your mouth, you are using physical language, which means you are in contact with the person you are talking to. Now, there are some differences. I mean, the analogy doesn't hold up for every single truth about conversation. You can't say it's a truth about physical conversation. The main difference being that in a conversation we we don't always, but we can be communicating something. So I might tell you about how I went to the shops and the woman in the shop gave me the wrong change, and I said this is the wrong change, and she said no, it's the right change, and I could then sort of go on and explain what happened, and you would know something that happened to me, an experience that happened to me. Now, in a physical conversation, there isn't a communication as such, although you can argue that if you are teaching physical conversation, then you are communicating physical concepts. But it's not really the same sort of thing. So not everything about conversation holds true in physical conversation. It's just a metaphor. So if you can't actually communicate things in physical conversation, then you could ask, well, what's the purpose of physical conversation? You know, when I talk to someone, maybe I've got a purpose in mind. You know, with this video, I have a purpose in mind. I'm trying to communicate something. And that purpose is what guides me, what guides me to know what to say. So I have something in mind. I don't know exactly how I'm going to say it, but I basically put together some words and express it as best I can. And that's what drives me to create a particular set of words. Now, in physical conversation, that drive isn't there. And so in order to sort of give it that drive which is necessary, otherwise you're just sort of effectively repeating things as sort of unnecessary. In order to give it that drive, you have to have an objective to the physical conversation. Now, this is where the use of physical games comes into play, because up until this point with the concept of physical conversation, we didn't need to necessarily play a game. We could do things by rote, and I've got nothing against doing things by rote, especially in the learning environment, but it can't be an ultimate. Beyond learning things by rote has to be self-expression, essentially. Now, this objective is much like the objective of a game. So there's various different physical games that we can play that lead to physical conversations. So I'll give you a few examples. So one game might be we are on raised platforms, not too high because obviously we might get injured if someone falls off, but raised up high enough so that if someone pushes someone off, we know it's happened. We can't pretend it hasn't happened. It's not theoretical. You have actually been pushed off if you've been pushed off, or if you've been pulled off, or basically if you've fallen off, if you've come off those platforms, we know that you've come off those platforms. So both people will be attempting in this particular game to push the other person off those platforms, or pull, or just doesn't. When I say push, I manipulate the other person off those platforms. And that would be our objective, which creates the dynamics, which creates the words. The exact set of words may depend on the exact set of words that were said to you when the other person's been trying to push you on. So your responses to them and their responses to you is what creates all that diversity and all those phrases and all that self-expression. So that's one particular example, but it's not hard to see that there could be other examples. Clearly, standard wrestling, take fast wrestling for example, throwing someone to the ground being the objective, that's a physical conversation. This is, a very common one, culturally speaking. It does have some downsides. All physical conversations, all games have their downsides. The way I judge whether a physical conversation game is a success or not is by looking at the clarity within it. What do I mean by clarity? Well, what I mean is, let's say you're having a conversation and it's a bit chaotic. No one's quite sure. You're talking at cross purposes. No one's quite sure what the other person's saying, and it's sort of turning into a bit of an argument. There's a bit of argy-bargy. Nothing's really getting communicated. People aren't really feel like they're being listened to. I'm sure we've all had conversations like this, and they're not that pleasant particularly. So the same can be said for physical conversations with their objectives. And if you pick an objective which there's nothing wrong with, you can have any particular objective, but the way you choose objectives affects the clarity of the conversation, and I particularly like to have clear conversations. Obviously there are martial arts advantages in terms of practicing more body grappling, wrestling oriented art forms than the ones I tend to practice, but then those people that practice them are practicing them for a different reason than I'm practicing them for. I'm just attempting to have a physical conversation, whereas other people are attempting to get some kind of martial arts benefit out of it. Right, so other things that I've found particularly clear forms of physical conversations are a variant on the raised surface idea, which is a circle idea, where one person is inside a circle and the other person is not inside that circle. It's quite a small circle, so that you can only really have one person occupying it at a time. The person on the outside of the circle will attempt to displace the person on the inside of the circle and establish themselves within the circle. And this, of course, leads to a different type of physical conversation, and you will see different words and different phrases and different ideas being communicated and explored within that type of physical conversation. Also, there is what I would call a double hand grappling type of physical conversation, which utilises arm locks. In this physical conversation, the objective is to get the other person onto the ground, but only by using arm grappling. So no body grappling, no headlocks, no punching, this kind of thing. And this is actually a particularly aesthetic form of physical conversation, as when you see two people practicing it who are good at it, it looks a lot like dancing. And there are several other good ways of performing physical conversations. Now obviously I can't really go into an exhaustive list of all the different types of physical conversation. Now someone might come to me and say, well, what's the purpose of having a physical conversation? Isn't conversation good enough? And from experience, what I've found is that actually there is a sort of human need for physical intimacy, and what it does, having this physical intimacy creates a relationship which is much more open than you would have if you just used if you just use words to try and get to know someone. But actually, physically knowing someone, you can know someone a lot better and have a much deeper relationship with them than just by knowing what they say in their words. So that's physical conversations. Now there's a question. Yes, there are lots of different types of physical conversation that you can have with different games which can be played with different objectives. But is there an overall grammar, an overall dictionary to all these different types of physical conversation? And you can say sort of, perhaps, there's definite commonalities between the different types of physical conversation. An arm lock in one type of conversation is not quite the same as an arm lock in another type of conversation. They're different, but the human arm, because of its limitations, can only move in so many ways. And it's this knowledge of the human body that I believe can form the bedrock for any type of physical conversation. So if, like me, you're interested in physical conversations, plural, then one has to explore the dynamics, the natural dynamics of the human body. And this is the material that I like to actually train in repetitively, to condition myself and to make myself better at having these physical conversations. Now, there's a lot of mileage to be had by having actual physical conversations, and I've trained, more free play oriented methods, and I've also trained more conditioned oriented methods, and both have their benefits. The conditioned oriented methods are good as long as the conditioning is good, as long as it teaches you about the human body, because you get to learn a lot of different things about how people move and how you move, and you get to experience an intuitive grasp of the human body. The sort of free play based methods, where you have to pick a certain type of physical conversation, are good because you don't want to be too idealistic about the body. I know, for example, that my arm has, I can say, perhaps 10 basic joint locks available, but actually being able to apply them in a sort of free play situation, I wouldn't necessarily be able to do unless I practiced actual free play. And the only way of practicing an actual free play is to have a particular objective. If you don't have an objective and you try and, for example, put all your conditioning elements together, then you're not really practicing, you're not really getting that benefit of the free play. You're just putting conditioned elements together, and it might sort of evolve gradually into a free play, but it's never going to give you that essential knowledge that a true free play experience gives you. So that's everything I wanted to say about physical conversations.